I will, if you have a question, I'll bring the microphone to you, and then I'd like to request the presenters, if a question is asked to one of you and you feel that your presentation is tied to it, feel free to chime in. Yes? Okay, good. So I see that there's a question that needs to be asked immediately, so I'll go ahead with this. And we're running behind, so I'll need us to stop at 11:10. Yeah?
Thank you. My name is Ebenezer Akwa. And my question goes to the first presenter. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name. Wanji. Yeah. I just want to find out from you the limitations that you envisage going into that hostile terrain, Sudan. Some of the limitations that you envisage.
Thank you for your question. So I'll actually be going there this summer for about 3 months to do my field work. I'll be doing some interviews in Juba, the capital, as well as in 3 different communities. And to be honest, there's so much that's unknown because, as far as I know at least, this kind of research hasn't been done by independent scholars or people who are going on their own. It's mostly had institutional support from NGOs. So I do anticipate some issues just with that in terms of building connections and the level of trust that community members may have. Also, a lot of my questions will actually be about governance. So especially when interviewing representatives of the national government and others, I'm not sure to what extent they'll really be able to discuss the way in which community self-determination and access to services is being inhibited, and the way in which resources are being distributed to the community level. Because South Sudan actually has a really great constitution. It does accommodate for the rights of a lot of minority groups, for women, for children, but the implementation has been a very different experience for South Sudan. So I do think it'll be difficult to try and identify the ways in which there's that discrepancy.
Good morning. I'm Ron Bailey, head of the Department of African American Studies, and I want to applaud the panel for a very provocative set of presentations. And I want to ask 2 questions, I think. 2 professors, Lowe and Carter. I wonder if you would extrapolate from your findings to talk about what the perception might be of African American volunteers in Africa, because we talk a lot about the smaller number of black students from the U.S. going abroad, studying abroad, or in the foreign service or international occupations. So I wonder if you see some implications from what you found that might give us some insights as to how we work with this as we encourage more students to go abroad. And my second question would be to Festus. There was a recent RFP, a request for proposals, that asked folks in the university to think about how the university's extension program here at Illinois and within Illinois could be used to address some issues around the state in a way that hadn't been done. And so we said that we wanted to use that model to that service to impact on particularly urban students of color. And I wonder if you found in your work that there are studies of the effectiveness of extension workers inside the U.S. from the Department of Agriculture or other units. I mean, is that a body of research that's developed and can be accessed? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there are several different ways to look at the question that you pose. And I think it's a very important question. As a person with a social work background and social science research background, I have a real concern and interest in understanding how to bridge that gap between African American young people. I have like 14 students in this audience today. One of the things that I think has hindered that connection has to do with experiences of African Americans, that disconnect, that historical disconnect. A small story, my husband is white. My husband he knows that his family settled in a place called Black, Missouri. You can find it on the map. That just boggles my mind. I'm just like, oh my God, there it is, Black, Missouri. This is where your people were. That is amazing to me. I can't do that. I can't say, this is the particular African country from which my ancestors came. And I think as African Americans, we have very limited actual knowledge of anything pertaining to sub-Saharan Africa, the west coast of Africa, where our ancestors came from. And so we are vulnerable to the impact of misinformation and the distortions to the media and the history that we received growing up. So we really don't have a clue. I was very enlightened by those respondents, particularly the one where the very few organizational members or staff members and community members who said that when there is a Black international volunteer, regardless of where they come from, what part of the world, that there may be that, and again, I hope I'm capturing their meaning correctly, that they feel some sense of he belongs to us. He is ours. I would hope that that would be the case. I think the more we're able to foster those kinds of relationships, I think the more that we are able to present the accurate pictures and images of what does Africa look like and feel like, and if there were more African American students present at the African Student Organization Forum, I think we have to start there. So one of the things I'm hoping to do is take a group of students to Africa next summer as a study abroad program to Wells Pope and see what that gets us.
Thank you. I think you know about the Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources and Related Sciences program? That's a very nice area where you could get some information about perception. We had a conference 2 weeks ago in Alabama, Birmingham. It's a big program. There's Professor Dr. Jesse Thompson in our college, who is the assistant dean, can provide information on that. Now, for your question on the impact of extension in the US, the literature is actually huge on the impact of extension in the US. However, the area that I'm looking at, the productivity of extension workers has not been done. So that's a very strong, it's very assertive. So even when I was presenting my defense, the professors were like, yeah, it has not been done. The reason is because of this problem of attribution, how you could be able to disentangle what extension does to production generally, and in particular the efforts of the extension workers. So it has not been done, but in terms of information on just generally in the US about extension, I mean, there's a lot, the literature exists. Thanks.
My name is Richard Kenya. I have one question from Dr. Kata. Not a question, it's a comment. Normally, people from mainly East Africa have a tendency of welcoming visitors, and normally, if you go out there and you collect information, sometimes they won't give you the actual picture of what they mean. So you need to dig out for the basics of what they really mean. For example, I can give you my experience in Karamoja region in Uganda. I went out and were asking about sanitation and asking about toilets. And I asked, when I asked myself, they told me, oh, we don't have toilets. But when I went out and saw the toilets, they were very clean. When I went behind them, I saw the toilets, they were clean and they're not utilized. So I asked one of my subordinates that, please go and ask them why they don't utilize the toilet. But because I was a visitor, they told me some other things and I wouldn't tell. So when my colleague came and asked, because she knew she has been with them, they told her that really we don't use the toilets because they are for the visitors. So the respect for the visitor is more than what they have to do to keep their health. So that is one comment I would have to contribute towards your work. Then, Festus, about Uganda, well, in Uganda, NGOs are doing great work, and but the problem with most of our NGO work is that the linkage between the government, because we know that the structures, we have a government that doesn't have all the resources, but the linkage between the NGOs and the government, because the government also tries, but there are no facilitation and the extension workers don't work. But the linkage is not well built. So how is CKW trying to build that linkage between the organization and the government so that at least the structures work well? Because we need continuity. CKW is not going to be in Uganda for a long time. We need that continuity.
My name is Abiodun Ki. So I have 3 questions. The first one is for Dr. Emmanuel. So towards the ending of your talk, you showed a number of plots, and if I recall correctly, the central message of your talk was that African countries shouldn't be too happy about the fact that there's a lot of money and the GDP seems to be rising. But from those plots, if I compare the later part of your plots to the other, like the plots, you had plotted GDP against time, like years, and it seems to me like there's a longer time period in which the GDP seems to be rising, and I don't know if you can, because it seems like the GDP is rising for a longer time period. How are you sure that the trend will not continue? I don't know if I remember. I mean, in the context of that the plots you showed, and also you only said that you should save the money. I mean, African countries should just save their money in funds and all that. What other ways could they develop these countries with growing GDPs that they now have? So that's the first question. Now, the second question is for Festus. Right, so your model, it wasn't clear, right? But my question really is, are those models descriptive or predictive? Like, when I say descriptive, are you fitting data to your models, or are you trying to predict things from your model even before you have data? Then also, I was wondering if you compared your data to, because you only talked about rural areas, because there are some places where they have well-developed transport networks in Africa, like for instance, Lagos, where I'm from. And I was wondering how that changes things. Would it still be the same results that you get, or would it be different? Then finally, the third question is for Professor Janet and Benjamin, basically. So my question is, the study was only done in Kenya, and as he said that they had a positive perception for foreigners in Kenya. In my opinion, I think there are some places in Africa where the opinion that they have about white people is different, and I won't mention the place, but there are places where they actually kidnap white people because it's more expensive. There are some whites more expensive, and some actually black, but later actually it's about white. So I was just wondering how that changes perception of things. So thank you.
think we totally are aware that there's bias in the sense that, one of the researchers was Kenyan, and two were white, and they're probably going to tell us a lot of things that they would not tell someone who was, so even this Kenyan was from Nairobi, and so when she would go to these rural areas, I think there's also a perception of her as someone from Nairobi and not someone from the villages. So I do think there's definitely more negativity out there than we heard from our data. But I think that negativity is also associated with race and development. So it's not that they had necessarily contact with white Americans or Norwegians or whatever, but the perceptions are probably from, again, sort of dynamics that are across the world stage. So development discourse, things that are on the news, other issues. So whether or not we heard the negative things, I think there's also this the central premise that there's something with the development aid infrastructure that is tied to the racial dynamics and how people perceive themselves and how people perceive other white development workers. I don't know if that answers your question, because we didn't hear the negative things.
Actually, when I talk about it, it will be someone from Nairobi and go maybe to here, Nakuru, that person from Nairobi to Nakuru is a visitor.
Yeah.
Neither is black or white, is a visitor. Normally, what happens is that they will tell you the better side of you what to expect. Yeah, and normally what I always did was, instead of having someone from my office, there is someone from within their community that always has to engage, get them to these sometimes, and get some clear differences between what your and also what the person within the community. I don't know if you try to do that.
Yeah, again, the study was more about it wasn't really about race originally, right? So these are the dynamics we kind of found in the research. But definitely we have thought about the dynamics of racial bias, and even just coming from the U.S., from Nairobi or whatever, those effects. The larger study, though, was really to understand the impacts of the volunteers. And I think that definitely would have been a better approach. In Peru, we did a research study in Peru after that one, and we used local information. We got very good information, so it's a very good point.
The value of having that insider facilitate that access is immeasurable, no matter where you're doing qualified work. There's always that slant that shows up, and you have to figure out ways to interpret how much of it is actual stuff versus what is being presented in a certain way for some other reasons. So whether it's best forward to impress you, to respect, whatever those things may be, that it's one of the difficulties of qualitative research, but it's also one of the most intriguing pieces and one of the pieces of our very well. That's it.
Right, I think I'll answer the questions. You asked two questions. The first one is how am I sure, this is the way I heard it, how am I sure GDP will not continue to rise, given that it has been rising for long, right? Now, you look at the graph there, you can see that this is just to 1960. There are other countries where you can get this till 1900 or 18, You will always see the boom and bust, as in you will always see periods when the economy is growing and periods when there's a dip. So this is the norm. Economies don't continue growing in perpetuity, as in they just keep going. No, it doesn't happen that way. Most times economies have to be reset when they hit that period. When there's a dip, like the Nigerian economy, it grew from 1960, then there's a dip about 1970, and then you see growth again from 1970 till the early 80s. In that growth you can see some small cycles of dip, but there was growth. And then there was the big dip due to structural adjustment program and all that in the 80s, and then it plateaued, till the 90s when the government was struggling to see what they can do to keep this economy going. A lot of Nigerians left the country, they were sending money back back home, Western Union and all that, it plateaued. And then you see this rise that happened again because of what happened to oil, to crude oil. The price of crude oil went through the roof. And for so many African countries, you see the price of crude oil went through the roof, or China came into the scene, and then you have this growth. The price of crude oil will not continue going through the roof. Someday it will crash, believe me. And China will not continue, coming for African resources the way it's having African resources at this rate. The Chinese economy is already beginning to stumble right now as we speak. So the reasons for this period of wealth that we're seeing will change. And then we will have that dip again. It will happen. So for me, it's about, what are we doing with the wealth that we're seeing now? Your second question was, apart from saving the money, what else can we do? Actually, sovereign wealth funds are not just to be saved. Sovereign wealth funds are funds that some countries have a lot of it. They do save a huge part of it. Some other countries, lots of countries, or all countries, invest a good part of it, to yield. They invest in long-term bonds and all that. That's partly why we hear that China holds a lot of US debts. It's in bonds that they have invested in, hoping that they can cash it in the rainy day. So these sovereign wealth funds for lots of countries are not just sitting in the bank, they're using it. Now, the other side of it is, should countries just put their money in sovereign wealth funds and not use this money to fight poverty in everyday life? The Nigerian sovereign wealth fund is just $1 billion. Part of that thinking is that, they cannot put all the extra money they're making from crude oil into sovereign wealth fund. They have to build roads and build schools and all of that. So the Nigerian government, of course, has a lot of this money that it puts into recurrent expenditure, for the country, and it puts into investment expenditure for the country every budgetary year. They do this, but the trouble is that, some of these things are over budgeted. So a road is $1 million, they say it's $20 million. So you've got all these things happening, then it goes into private pockets. For Nigeria, that I know as well, the good thing with Nigeria, with the corruption, is a lot of times those who steal the money invest it back in Nigeria. You can go to Nigeria and see this. They invest it back in Nigeria. But the downside to it is that you have money that should be for a road from Akure to Kano, because the people living along that axis, Akure to Kano, need that road for their agricultural products. So somebody steals the money and invests it in telecoms. You see where the problem comes in. Somebody steals the money and invests it in telecoms. So telecoms becomes too hot because everybody's stealing money and putting it in telecoms. And when people need roads from Akure to Kano, nobody's putting the money there. So you have this skewed investment from the money that is being stolen. That's one of the big things that is disturbing Nigeria at the moment, and some African countries too. These are some of the issues that are not being discussed and debated by experts, because unfortunately, some of the Western experts that go to Africa go with certain areas they want to talk about and certain areas they want to research. It's left for the African researchers who are here, the Nigerian researchers. 1 in 5 is a Nigerian, or 1 in 6 is a Nigerian. Look at your own economy and look at what you can do in your own economy to make it work for, Nigerian people. The same for Cameroon, or for Ghana, or Kenya, or Tanzania. We have the know-how already to take our economy, pull it apart, look at what's happening in there, and see what to do about it, rather than just waiting for the World Bank reports to come out and see what we can do with the World Bank report. That's a different agenda. I'll stop there. Thanks.
So I'll start with you and I'll continue. Generally in economics, we say all models are wrong, some are useful. So my model here is actually an abstraction, but to answer your question, we feed data to it. All right, it's subject to data and has been used extensively in the social sciences. The linear image model it has been used extensively. If you go to Google, just Google linear image model, you see. And these guys said their computer is the one that converts that model. So the problem is not with me. And it can be applied, it can be applicable to many other places. We take the rural areas for now because that's where the CKW project operates. But it's actually meant to be mainstream in other countries, other areas. For your question about the linkages, how can the CKW project bring about linkages between the government in Uganda and other stakeholders? That's been done. The CKW program actually, NADS used to be the main source of extension and agricultural advisory services. So the CKW work with them, and the cell phones are actually services provided by MTN, and the Ministry of Agriculture also has a stake in what's going on in the country. So in the CKW program, it's meant to be sustainable, to empower the rural folks to increase their productivity. Thanks.
My question was, if the government appreciates, take up that role.
Oh, you mean if the government is appreciating that? Well,
because that is the strength that we need government to meet themselves.
that's the administrative part of that. My research was not meant for that. But I think every project like this has a sustainability aspect. So I think that can be addressed. Or maybe you could do a research on that. Be an extension of my research. Thanks.
The last question from Bokoni.
Thank you very much. This is a question for Tanjit on South Sudan. This is a country that I am very familiar with, even when it was still a region of the Greater Sudan. You said that your impression of your findings this far are that there's not a whole lot of critical research going on. Obviously, part of the problem is the lack of institutions. And I just want to find out if, even in terms of statistical data from government ministries, if there is a serious effort to maybe revitalize or create entirely new institutions, because from 1972 to about 1985 was really the period that there was any semblance for South Sudan to create a government. This was since independence in 1956. There was war. In fact, the war broke between the North and South in 1955, a year before independence. So it meant that that whole period up to 1972, no institutions in South Sudan. Then 72 up to 85, 83, the second war, liberation started. So you can see from about 85 up to when the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, was signed in the 2007 or something like that. So there have been these big breaks in terms of lack of institutions. So my question is, are there serious efforts by all these so-called development partners to create the kind of institutions that in normally functioning nation states are the engines where a lot of critical research is funded or carried out? Thank you.
So obviously part of the problem is the educational pipeline in creating scholars that have the capacity to do that kind of research. And if they're struggling at the elementary level and the secondary level, there are very few South Sudanese students that go on to university. So that's one of the issues. Juba University was actually relocated to the North during the Civil War, and so it was only moved back down to South Sudan a few years ago. But it's been closed intermittently, partly because of violence that's been going on. So that hasn't really, unfortunately, been a sustainable source of training and development for the South Sudanese students. But it is something that's being worked on. And they have developed partnerships with universities around the world, and one of the areas in which that's being done is the library. And just in finding a way to maintain the resources and knowledge that South Sudan has, that unfortunately, a lot of the documents were either lost, destroyed, or weren't treated very well during the Civil War. So they are developing a capacity to maintain that kind of knowledge, which is helping a lot. And in addition to that, South Sudan is attempting to develop national level institutions, for example, to conduct a census, or to do other kinds of data collection and evaluation, which should help in this kind of institutional national level knowledge. But they are struggling. So it's these are not institutions that have been developed thoroughly and strongly enough to provide the kind of services that they're meant to. So there are developing initiatives, but again, right now at least, a lot of the information on South Sudan, whether it's in terms of how many people have access to education or healthcare and basic services, a lot of that information still comes from NGOs. So they are working on it, but unfortunately there still is a dependency on it for information on foreign entities.
Thank you very much. I'd like just 2 comments. One, the common thread in our discussion was the need for Africa to have strong institutions. This is a sentiment that President Obama said when he went to Ghana, because weak institutions, we need to have strong institutions. As a Kenyan, it would not be good for me to not speak to your presentation. In understanding the psyche of the Kenyan, you have to know that Kenya was a settler state. So the legacy of colonization sits very well in the psyches of Kenyans. And even Gogi Wakilmo has written about decolonizing the mind here. That's the kind of, the relationship between the Mzungu and the Kenyan is something that has to be examined. Yes, Africans are very good at welcoming people, but there is something that has to be said about this relationship that we're speaking about. And with the emerging of the Kenyan, of Africa, and therefore emerging of the middle class, the hope can be that the middle class might be the source of getting the vocabulary around discussing race issues in Kenya, because they sit there and then we don't have the vocabulary to discuss them. Yeah? And lastly, I thank everyone for coming for this session, and I think we should applaud our presenters. Then let me belabor this, kindly go on to #2014 ASO Forum and put in your comments. Thank you very much.
So we're going to transition right into our next session.